Hello, language enthusiasts, and welcome to The Language Worker, a space to talk about the people involved in the language business in a broad sense. I'm interested in finding out how their training, work experience, and their passion for languages has shaped our guests' professional and, of course, personal lives. Join me on this journey to explore the multiple and unpredictable paths one can follow when we are involved in the magical world of languages.
I met Beth when I was looking for a conference interpreter, and it was pretty obvious that she was very professional. These days, Beth is working on her PhD research and learning all that she can about inclusive language. Listen to what this impressive young language worker has to say about interpreting and about the work that she's doing to make the world more inclusive.
Hi, everybody. Today we have Beth with us, and I know Beth because I hired her. Yeah. So if you're still in touch with your vendor manager, it means that it didn't go terribly wrong, right? So if you could just talk a little bit about yourself, Beth, and a bit of your background, where you're from, and all that stuff, and then we'll just have a little bit of a chat.
Absolutely. So I'm Beth. I am a PhD researcher in Brussels, and I am also a conference interpreter. I work with English, French, and Spanish, and my main specialization is inclusive language.
So that's in your PhD, right? Or even in your professional?
I guess you could say both. It's the focus of my research, but it is also something that I definitely actively try to use in my professional life as well. And of course, personal life.
Yeah. So when did it all start? So, I mean, I tried to look, like I told you, I tried to look at your LinkedIn profile and I was like, whoa, so many things. I don't know where to start. So I decided not to have any specific questions because I'll just let you go through it.
Yes, so I studied interpreting and translation as my undergraduate degree. I graduated from that in 2019. But even way before then, I always knew I wanted to be an interpreter. I visited Strasbourg when I was a child, and we walked past the European Parliament, and seeing all of the flags, and as someone who's quite politically engaged, the idea suddenly came to me, and I thought, wow, one day I could do what the people in the EU Parliament do. I can use my passion for languages alongside my passion for talking.
That's important.
And from that point on, it really became my goal to become an interpreter. So I went to university, studied interpreting and translation. My passion for interpreting did not at all dwindle during that time. If anything, I became even more determined, thanks to the support from my interpreting tutors. And after that, I decided to go and live in the south of Spain for a year, teaching languages. That was a wonderful experience, perfect after 4 years of hard work, enjoying the Andalusian sunshine, really practicing my Spanish, eating lots of good food. It was a good time. I then, in the middle of the pandemic, went back to Scotland, where I did a master's degree.
Because you didn't say that you were Scottish, but everybody has already been thinking about your accent, I'm sure.
Yes, of course, yes. I'm Scottish. I studied in Edinburgh, from near Glasgow originally. So I went back to Scotland, where I did a master's in interpreting. Absolutely loved it. It was there where I first started researching inclusive language, because honestly, I sort of became interested by osmosis because my other half has been very passionate about inclusive language, particularly inclusive language in French, for several years. And so if she'd be reading books or doing research, I would sort of pick up the papers, pick up the books, flick through them, and realize, oh, this is pretty interesting. It's pretty important. And so I decided that I would focus my research for my master's dissertation on inclusive language in French and Spanish in conference interpreting.
Oh, wow. I see.
Yes, and so that's sort of how I came to that aspect of my career. After I graduated from my master's in 2021, I worked as a freelance for a while, doing some interpreting, doing some translation as well. I've had the opportunity to do some fantastic gigs. Highlights were probably film festivals. That was fantastic, particularly at the Catalan Film Festival in Glasgow. I had the chance to interpret for an incredibly inspirational Black trans woman from Brazil. Yeah, she was living in Brazil, but was a native Spanish speaker. And yeah, for Greenpeace, for other environmental organizations, NGOs. And in February 2022, I moved to Brussels. And I absolutely love living here. It's the perfect place to be for linguists. So many wonderful opportunities. My partner is working as a translator at the Council of the EU.
Okay.
So basically,
it all comes
job.
together.
Yes. And I started my PhD scholarship last October. Yeah, so that's a bit about me. I basically, in the space of a couple of years, have managed to pick up lots of wonderful opportunities, some really fantastic gigs. I've lived in some fantastic places, and now I'm basically doing my
Living the
dream
life.
thing, living my dream life, getting to research something I'm super passionate about, living my best linguistic life, surrounded by so many languages. Yeah, life's good.
Okay, that's great. But I want to take you back to some technicalities, because I'm thinking that you're the first interpreter that I'm actually talking to on the podcast. So that's impressive. And I know a few interpreters, obviously. I've even done some gigs myself. Let's not talk about those. But it's such a hard job. So I'm just wondering, when you first came in contact with what really entails to be an interpreter. I mean, when you were probably still back in college, how did that feel when you had to learn so many specific things that basically only apply to that, and you cannot live without, like, all the boots and the dealing with microphones and dealing with that kind of software that I have no idea of, and that kind of thing. I know that I had a friend, a Polish friend. He's a very good interpreter, and he used to show us a little bit of his type of specific writing that you have, I think, just to make notes super quick and all of that. So how was it when you were like, yeah, I want to be an interpreter, but you probably, I mean, as you were super young, you didn't even know the ins and outs of the job, right? So how was it, the first impact, when you realized it was such a technically challenging job?
Sure. I mean, you basically got it in a nutshell. Like it was my absolute dream. I knew where I wanted to be. I knew what the job was, but it was a bit of a reality check for me when the first time I really vividly remember the first time that I sat in a booth, because my university has fantastic facilities. They have their own interpreting booths that are modelled on those
that's fancy.
At the EU Parliament and the UN. And yeah, I remember sitting in there, and the first time that I had to do simultaneous interpreting, thinking, oh no, have I made a mistake? Because, as you say, it's extremely technical. There is so much going on in your mind all at once, because it's not just the understanding the language, it's also making sure that the language that you're producing is clear, that it makes sense, that it's concise, that you're not confusing anyone, while also managing the sound quality, the headsets, all of that sort of stuff, the note taking. Although the note taking is more particular to consecutive interpreting. Consecutive interpreting is where someone will give a speech, you'll take the notes as they're talking. Once they're finished, you'll stand up, you'll recite the same speech in a different language. So in my case, English. And I think if you speak to a lot of interpreters, they will tend to have a preference for simultaneous interpreting. I'm one of the few who actually really enjoys consecutive. I really enjoy the note-taking. I enjoy standing up and pretending to be someone else for a while. To me, it's a little like acting. I'm not as nervous when I pretend to be somebody else. I don't know if other interpreters feel that way. But yes, so as I say, when I first started, huge reality check, thrown in at the deep end, giving it a go. But yeah, I definitely had a few moments of, oh, I don't know if this is right for me, because my whole life I've been such a perfectionist. Like, if I don't get something straight away, I'm probably not going to do it.
So when you felt that way, were you like, oh my God, what am I going to do? But did you actually do well when you first started with your first, let's say testing phases, right? At uni?
I mean, yeah, I get very nervous in exam settings. So I would always kick myself after exams thinking that I definitely didn't do as good as I could have. And definitely that was a repeated pattern throughout my courses. But it definitely all changed for me when I had my first like real life gigs. Because once you realize that you are there not for people to judge you, but to help people, right? Like that's your job, is if you weren't there, they wouldn't be able to understand.
That's true.
So you're there as a tool to facilitate communication. And once you get that into your head, the whole process becomes so much easier. Well, for me anyway. So it might seem a bit of an oxymoron, but definitely when I first started working, it was so much less stressful to interpret.
So what was that first gig, without being too specific, if you can't, because I'm sure, there's always those questions, but I mean, just in general, what kind of gig was it?
So the first time that I ever tried real life interpreting was my university organizes every year a really brilliant event. It's a multilingual debate, and they invite people from the local community, they invite local schools, and basically they have a panel of people, they have a topic, and they are all invited to debate this topic. And they give final year undergraduate students and master's students the opportunity to interpret. That's all, pretty much all of us who do that course, that's our first real experience of something that we're not graded for. It's just to show us what it's like to be an interpreter. So that was the first time for me actually interpreting for an audience who were very much relying on me. The first time I was so stressed, so nervous, like the pressure is enormous. But yeah, after you've done that a few times, you get more used to being scared, I guess you could say. Like it's the adrenaline rush. You learn to
deal with that more than with your skills, right?
Yeah,
I guess.
Instead of using the adrenaline, like instead of panicking from that sense of, oh no, people are relying on me. What do? I need to be perfect. You sort of learn to just sort of sit back and let that adrenaline just take you forward and continue to interpret.
But that was still in a pretty well-known environment. What about even more real life when money was involved?
So not with money being involved, but I started volunteering shortly after I'd completed my master's degree. And yeah, that again, being a first, so bearing in mind as well, this was during the pandemic. Everything was online. I had to totally change my way of working. You no longer, so when you're doing simultaneous interpreting, you always have a booth partner, or you should always have a booth partner.
Yes. If it's something, well done, well prepared.
Yes, yeah, of course. And having to learn how to work with your booth partner, with them being not in the same place as you. At the time, there were trying to use softwares like Zoom. They had interpreting functions, but they weren't, you could tell they weren't designed by interpreters, because there was no function to work with your booth partner. So that first real life assignment I had to have one computer that I was connected to do the interpreting. I had to have another computer so that I could listen to other interpreters, and then I had to have another device like my phone or something, or a tablet, so that I could communicate with my booth partner. And so yeah, that was like the experience of interpreting for the very first time. Doing that in real life for the very first time is it sort of, yeah, it's a real challenge for the mind for interpreting.
But you did didn't I hire you for something that was in person, and that was a conference? Wasn't that what the company hired you for? No.
I've never done any in person
So it wasn't like that already.
assignment for, the only in-person assignments that I've done since completing my master's have been the film festivals that I referenced before. So yes, that first assignment where I was actually interpreting for other people, and another thing as well was because it was an international organization, there were people speaking in accents that I wasn't very familiar with at all.
Were you working from Spanish or?
The very first assignment, I was working from and into English French, and it was an event talking about environmental issues in different African countries. And the speakers that I was interpreting for were from Democratic Republic of Congo and Burkina Faso. And yes, I had tried as best as I could to prepare listening to clips on YouTube.
Right.
But it was incredibly stressful. I think my poor booth partner who I was working with had to deal with some panicking, with some tears, with them having to suddenly take over because I literally couldn't carry on with what I was saying sometimes. But I think a lot of interpreters probably have similar stories.
Because it's such a stressful kind of thing. So do you prefer to do it, like you said just before, from and into, so I'll try to keep that, Spanish or French?
Interesting question, because before I would have said Spanish, because after living in Spain, my Spanish was pretty good. I was very confident, but because now I live in Brussels, I'm using French every day. My university is a French-speaking university. My research is into French language. So now I have French as a B language, which means it's a language that I work into when I'm interpreting. And I feel much more confident with French than Spanish. However, I still work from Spanish, and I still absolutely love it. But
I guess it
definitely,
will have to do
yeah.
with your circumstances in life when you have two, languages like that, so that you go through phases depending on what's going on in your
Yeah, yeah,
existence.
yeah.
That's what's funny in our relationship with languages too, right? Because our
Mhm.
real life has such an impact in our work life, because it's true that we have at certain moments in our lives a closer relationship to one language than the other. So that is something I totally understand. Yeah. So, but can you, before we even get into your research, just, I don't know if everybody knows the different types of interpreting that exist, because you already mentioned consecutive, which means that the person speaks, right, and then you take your notes, and then you speak, you are the other person, and then you speak as if you were the other person, and
Yeah.
then you have simultaneous, right, which means that it's like they're speaking, one sentence they stop, no, they never stop, right, they keep on going, and you just have to somehow.
Yeah, absolutely. So simultaneous interpreting is probably the one that people are most familiar with, I would say. I think it's what people think of when you tell them that you're an interpreter. The sort of interpreting you see people sitting in the booths at international institutions like the EU, like the UN. The speaker is talking, and at the same time we are in the booth with our headsets on, with our microphones, and we simultaneously, I say in inverted commas,
Yes.
because it's impossible to be saying something at exactly the same time as somebody else, if that makes sense. There's always a tiny little bit of a gap. And interpreting this is what we call décalage. It's the gap that you allow yourself between what the speaker is saying and you interpreting. Yeah, but essentially that's it. The person speaks, we speak at the same time in a different language.
So keeping the French terminology, I know of, because I've done it. My favorite part of the whole interpreting, it's a little bit less stressful, I would say, and it's I guess it's probably easier if you need to do it under circumstances. So there is the chuchotage, right?
Yes, absolutely. Chuchotage is probably the one that I'm least familiar with out of the different modes. That involves somebody speaking and you sit beside someone who requires your interpreting and whisper what is being said to them. But I have never actually done this in real life, and it didn't feature very heavily in my training. So I don't want to speak too much about that because I don't want to
No,
give
I
any
understand.
false
It's just that
information.
it's very circumstantial. It's like if everybody else in the room speaks a certain language and only one person doesn't speak the language, right? So that's very particular. That happened to me when I was working in research, and we had a bit of a meeting. It wasn't a conference, right? So it was a meeting. And there was only one person who couldn't speak Portuguese. So I had to do it because of that. And that was a lot of fun. I like doing it. And also my experience with interpreting was actually a painful experience because I didn't know what I was going to do. And it was a pretty high level situation that I didn't know I was getting into. I already posted about that. So someone hired me to go and interpret at an event. And then in the end, it was the best soccer player of all time, Pelé. And I had to be on stage with him.
Wow.
That's
amazing.
That is just the scariest probably event of my existence, because there were 2,500 people in the venue itself, and then it was being streamed live, and it was a big event, and I had no idea. I only found out a few days before, and I'll tell you, it was very, very hard situation, but it happened.
Absolutely.
And we all survived. And then I spent a whole week with Pele, which was absolutely amazing, because then all he required was more of a chuchotage situation again. And that was totally fine, because we had interviews with a lot of journalists from all over the world, and that was a lot of fun. So it was a big event in Los Angeles. So that was my experience. And I was like, oh my God, I'll never, ever do this again. And why me? Why me? So yeah, because it was a favor to a friend, and it was just That's
And
strange
did you ever
situation.
do it again in the end?
I don't think so. I don't think so.
No.
I don't think I could because I'm too scared.
Mhm.
I don't
Yeah.
think so. But you never know. I mean, things just happen in such a way that if you had asked me back then, I would have said no too, because they didn't tell me what it was at all.
Mhm.
And it was like a friend, someone I had met in a certain circumstance. So I
Yeah.
thought it was going to be fine. And in the end, it was just so scary because when they started wiring me, it was when I realized what was happening. And I thought I was going to die right there. And I almost did.
Mhm. I think it really shows how interpreters can be used in so many different settings, and how it's there are all these different modes available. For example, there are liaison interpreters. So, for example, public service interpreters, which is another completely different type of interpreting again.
It's more on the
That's
phone, right?
It can be, or it can be in person as well, where I guess it's almost like a combination of different modes, because it's a little bit like consecutive, because you can take notes, basically like mini consecutive chunks. It's basically you sit in the middle between usually two parties, but it can be more. They speak, you relay what has been said to the other person. They speak, you relay what has been said back to the original person. So that's a mode that's used commonly in settings like hospitals, police stations, courts as well. Yeah, so it just shows that interpreting is such a varied profession, and that just because you do one type of interpreting doesn't necessarily mean that you do all kinds of interpreting.
Right.
For example, I consider myself a conference interpreter, because certainly my experience and where I feel most comfortable with is in conference settings. As I said, simultaneous and longer consecutive. And I also think that you need to be very emotionally resilient. Sometimes to be a public service interpreter, you have to deal with many difficult issues. It's often used in settings where you're dealing with people who have gone through traumatic experiences, who are undergoing medical treatment. So yeah, I think for me that would be probably the most challenging type of interpreting.
I hear you. So throughout all of those adventures, then it was time, or you thought it was a great idea to do your PhD. And how did you choose? Did you go to Brussels on purpose because of the PhD, or was it for that, or were you already there and just decided to do it over there, or was there a particular program, or how did it happen?
So I moved here originally because my partner had been offered a fantastic opportunity at one of the EU institutions. So we sort of moved here. It was quite a last minute decision for me to also move here. I originally thought it was going to be for a few months, and we decided that we didn't want to leave. And so I decided that I wanted to find something more permanent here. And being extremely passionate about research, I happened to stumble across on LinkedIn, of all places, an advert or a job posting from a university in Brussels looking for a PhD researcher. And I decided to apply, and I was extremely lucky, and a few months later heard back from them that I'd been offered the position. Yeah.
So you already knew about the topic, or was it a bit up to
Yes.
you, or?
So it could be any topic that falls under the umbrella of translation and interpreting. And I had my idea already formed in my head, and so I had to write a proposal outlining what I wanted to do, and how I would conduct my research. So yes, I already had the idea fully formed, and had to send that to them for them to decide whether they wanted to hire me or not.
Yeah. So is it like you have classes for, well, I'm doing my PhD too, so that's, well,
Mhm.
I'll mirror my situation, see how close to yours is. So we have classes for about 2 years or so, and then we have another couple of years to develop the research itself. Is it like that, or did you go straight to the research part, or is it, because you call it a job,
Yeah.
right? And in my case,
Yes.
it's definitely not a job. It's I pay for it.
No, I'm very lucky. This is my full-time position now.
Mhm.
Although I still do some interpreting, but it's pretty much research from the word go. So I started in October straight away into designing the research, starting to read. Basically, my job, I'm being paid to research, which is
Mhm.
amazing. I realize that I'm extremely lucky to get to do this.
Mhm.
And yes, we do have classes, but not on a regular, for example, weekly or daily basis. It's
Mhm.
more they make trainings available to us, and we can go and learn about different research methods, GDPR, data storage, all of that good stuff.
Mhm. So what is the, can you talk about it? I don't know if you can. The specific topic of your research, like specifically is, or do you have a title or?
I don't want to go into specifics too much
Right.
because I'm quite
Early stages, right?
yeah, I'm in the early stages, and I don't want to give away too much. But generally, I am researching the use of French inclusive language by interpreters working from English into French, obviously.
Mhm. And by inclusive, we mean?
By inclusive, no, this isn't an easy
I
question
know.
to answer
That's why I ask.
without delving a little bit deeper. So
Go as
the
deep
way,
as you want.
yes, the way I define inclusive language,
Mhm.
as it says on the tin, it's language that doesn't exclude anybody. So in essence, language that doesn't make assumptions about people, and it doesn't it doesn't exclude anyone based on gender, on sexuality, and disability. Yes, but when we look at languages that are gendered languages,
Mhm. Latin languages, for example. That's why you
yeah, for
focus on French,
example,
right?
yes,
Mhm.
yes, it's a little bit more complicated, shall we
Mhm.
say? Because whereas in English, which is my native language, which is a natural gender language, incidentally, it means that we don't have as many grammatical rules that are dictated by gender.
Mhm.
In languages like French, like you said, like Portuguese, like Spanish, they are highly gendered languages grammatically, which
Yep.
means you can't escape it.
Nope.
And yes, and in these countries, inclusive language has basically come to encapsulate the idea of using language that that doesn't discriminate based on gender.
Mhm. So it's more a vocabulary and expressions and not so much focus on grammar, I would assume.
No, quite the contrary. Whereas in English, it focuses much more on things like vocabulary. Oh my goodness, sorry, vocabulary.
Yes.
For example, words that end in man, for example, postman, we might say postie.
Right.
Fireman, we might say firefighter.
Mm-hmm.
In French, for example, the inclusive language movement, shall we say, the idea of inclusive language.
Yeah, well, of course, you will have to manipulate grammar. And this is where the problem
Yes,
is. When I say that
exactly.
maybe you don't focus, or it's much harder to focus on grammar, it's because everything else, even if it sounds a bit strange, you can go a little bit around it. But it's just that it's, I suppose, very complicated for the Latin language speakers, a lot of S's there, to actually accept or incorporate, because it's not natural to manipulate grammar to that extent, right?
I don't look at it as being a manipulation, because I will speak mainly from the perspective of French, because that's where I focus my research. French already has numerous ways to be more inclusive, right? So for example, for me, the penny dropped when I read a book by a writer and historian from France called Eliane Viennot. And she wrote a wonderful book. And she's written a couple of fantastic books. The one that I read was called Non, le masculin n'emporte pas sur le féminin. And it really situates French inclusive language within a historical context. And the penny really dropped for me when I read this book, because as someone who learned French and who had to learn all of these grammar rules about that the masculine takes precedence over the feminine, etc., I realized that when I'd started learning this, and I'd sort of asked my teachers about why this was the case, it was always, oh, well, it's just grammar. It's got nothing to do with somebody's gender, with men, women, whatever. But this book, as I said, really situates it in a historical context, and it describes how it's not an accident that these languages are so masculine centric, that they have the generic masculine. In French, for example, that many feminine forms of certain professions were taken out of the language as well, that it was actually quite a deliberate change that was made to the language over time by people who were sort of in charge of gatekeeping the language, if you like. Bodies such as the Académie Française, the French Academy, basically to reflect patriarchal values, to try and ensure the status quo, men entering professions such as medicine, etc. And so I think once you fully grasp the idea that that language is this way for a reason, and because it is a tool to reflect patriarchal values, it's hard to come back from that. And so, as Viennot rightly says, it's very easy to use inclusive language because there are tools that have always existed. So the argument that it's unnatural, or that it somehow ruins the language to try and use formulations that are more inclusive, you just need to go back in time. You need to pick up a book and look at and see. For example, let's take the rule that when you're addressing a group of people, if there's, say, 100 women
and one man,
you use the masculine. You can, going back in time, you can find that there were other rules that were used, such as the proximity rule. That means basically, so if you have a sentence, the adjective that you use reflects the noun that's closest to it in a sentence. So if I give you an example, the men and women are beautiful. In that sentence, because woman is closer to the adjective agrees with the feminine form. If it was the other way around, the women and men are beautiful, then the adjective would refer to the masculine form, if that makes sense. Another rule could be the majority rule, it's called. So the majority rule dictates that in a room of say, 5 men and 2 women, you would use masculine. But if it was switched the other way around and there were more women than men, then you would use the feminine form. And so I don't see this as being a huge manipulation, because it's using tools that have already existed before in the past. I don't, although I realize I'm talking about all of this from a more distant perspective, than someone from France or Belgium, Switzerland, etc. would have, because I don't have as much of an emotional attachment to it.
That's true.
So for me, I can sit back, I can look at the findings of researchers who say that inclusive language is important and it's necessary, and here's the data that shows that using language that isn't inclusive, the negative effects that it has. But because, as I say, I don't have that emotional attachment, I can look objectively at this without feeling in any way threatened by it. I think if you're part of a community that predominantly speaks this language, it's something totally different. I think it's the non-binary writer Eris Young who writes in their book They, Them, Their, that the problem is that many people see language, well, not a problem, but the reality is that many people see society and language as being so totally intertwined. A language reflects a community reflects a language. And so if you have people coming in and saying the way that you use your language is, I don't want to say wrong, but you should change the way that you speak, then what are your
there are other alternatives.
There are other alternatives, then that can feel like not just a threat to language, but also to the community. And so, yeah, I went off on a bit of a tangent there.
No,
but
sure.
What I'm saying is that
That's great.
Totally recognize that it's very easy for me to say how important inclusive language is, particularly in such heavily gendered languages, while also recognizing that I can totally understand the objections.
So the thing is that language will evolve a certain way, and things will either get picked up or dropped, as they always have been, right? Of course, there's always been parts of society that have power and they are able to do things a certain way, and it's been here for such a long time. And also the formation of all Latin languages were specifically happening at a particular time in our history as humanity, and which was pretty recent. We just feel like it was a long time ago. But so there's a lot of potential for, for evolution and for everything else that's going to come. And I guess that's what it is. Time will tell what language will do with all this new information that it's actually probably recovered from more ancient times. So you feel that this will happen, but naturally it will, obviously, naturally, it will happen a certain way. But do you think that people will have some actions that they can do to really make sure that positive changes occur?
Absolutely. I mean, this is one of the debates, is that shouldn't language just be left to evolve naturally with the information that people have? Shouldn't the attention be focused elsewhere, perhaps on getting people who aren't men more into the limelight, giving more opportunities, quotas, etc. But there's another camp that says that no, we really need to try and do more to enforce inclusive language. So basically, the arguments fall into four camps. Right. One, that it's totally unnecessary. You have the people who say that what will language change? Language only reflects society's values. It reflects society's opinions. However, I think when you look at the research, that's not entirely true. There was a researcher, now let me think, their name is Kristen Schutze. She describes it as being like the climate change argument.
Okay.
Right? She says, you have all of this data that's available, all of this research that shows the negative impacts that non-inclusive language has. For example, the researcher Pascal Gigax has found that it has a direct impact on the number of job opportunities that there are for people who aren't men, for example. And so all that to say, language can evolve naturally, but I think that with a little bit of a push, we could really start to see real world impacts. Because Pascal Gigax has already found in research that when you do start to incorporate even something simple, like instead of just using the masculine form, using the feminine form as well, that women are more represented.
Mm-hmm.
And so
you mean in job ads, for example?
Yes, for example, like in Belgium,
Mm-hmm.
it's now mandatory for job posts, for example, to include both the masculine and feminine forms, because they consider that to be necessary.
Mm-hmm.
There are others who say that the attention should really be focused elsewhere. As I said, I don't entirely disagree, but I don't see attention as being a finite resource. Like, yes, okay, fine, attention should be focused on combating sexism in other areas, providing more opportunities, but I don't see the two as being mutually exclusive.
Mm-hmm.
Others say it's very complicated. Again, I feel like this is an argument that doesn't really hold water. I think that it's very easy to incorporate inclusive language just with a little bit of not awareness exactly, but just if you keep it in your head that the generic masculine can be exclusive.
Mm-hmm.
I think once you have that in your head, it's quite easy to avoid it. I would recommend for French speakers to follow the Revolution Inclusive page on Instagram. They have many different tips and tricks for being more inclusive without necessarily using, for example, inclusive writing where you use a dot or a slash or an asterisk.
Mm-hmm.
Because I think that's what people often think about when they say that inclusive language is complicated.
Mm-hmm.
But there are so many other ways that you can be inclusive just by simply using reformulations, by using epicene nouns that don't change based on gender, and using group nouns, for example, staff instead of naming the profession, for example, saying staff instead of teacher, or or school instead of pupils, for example.
I really like this proximity rule. I think
Yes,
that's the one I'm going to start using just to see what happens.
I
I
think
really enjoy it.
that's the thing, is that we everyone should recognize is that language doesn't belong to any particular person, it belongs to all of us. So
I
it's
can
up
already
to,
imagine a man being with a bunch of women, and then we saying everything in feminine, because it's only one of him, one of them. So I guess that could be a really cool experiment. Do you conduct experiments within your research, or is it or what kind of experiments? Are they more linguistically inclined? Are they more social?
More social. As I say, I don't want to go too much into details, because I'm still in the early stages. But yes, I am conducting experiments. My research isn't focused on whether we should or should not use inclusive language. My research is focused on the use of inclusive language, and interpreters' ability to use it, rather than whether we should or shouldn't. I don't think I'm the best person to say whether people should or shouldn't use it. That's not my place. My place is my idea is simply to see how prepared we are for in the future, when it is going to become more common for language practitioners to be asked to use inclusive language. It's becoming it's becoming more and more of a hot topic, I would say.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know how it is in the Portuguese-speaking world, but certainly in the Francophone world and in Anglophone countries as well. And so
the question is, not talking about your research, because that's what it is, and then you'll probably in a few years talk about it in the podcast, who knows. Hope I'm still here. So, but how prepared do you think, it's not you interpreters, but the people who work in the language service community, let's say that just as open as possible, how prepared are we to like focus or deal with or introduce or use inclusive language?
I think it will take time. I think that there are more and more resources being made available, but I don't believe that it comes particularly naturally to a lot of people yet. So I think there needs to be a focus on getting resources out there, and providing training. As I say, there are already so many fantastic practitioners in our field who are making such training and awareness raising sessions available. I already mentioned Révolution Inclusive. There are other organizations such as the Canadian organization Divergent, which focuses not only on masculine and feminine, but also ways to use non-binary language, which I think is incredibly important, particularly in languages that are so heavily gendered that in some cases, basically, people feel like they can't exist in their own identity. Anecdotally, I do have a couple of friends who are native German speakers,
Mm-hmm.
who are non-binary, and they feel so much more confident and comfortable expressing themselves in English because they feel like in German they don't have the tools to, or rather they do. The LGBT community, as you know, is so inventive with our language, and there are so many tools that we can find by looking at our community.
Mm-hmm.
And so non-binary people, of course, they know how to express themselves in their own language, but it's having that be recognized by everyone.
Mm-hmm.
That is the difficulty, but I think that could be extremely beneficial, not just for non-binary people, but also for the more general community. I think that the idea of gender neutral language it might be a bit of a pipe dream, but I think that the benefits would be very notable. For example, I know of a school in Sweden that only uses a gender neutral pronoun for all of the pupils, that there's no sort of idea of gender roles, and that they've found that it really limits the sense of there not being the same opportunities available to the pupils based on their gender, that it's that the subjects that the pupils choose isn't immediately obvious based on their gender, if that makes sense. Like it's not like boys are more likely to want to do sports and whatever. So I think in an ideal world, wouldn't it be wonderful if that could be, if the power of language was such that we no longer had to concern ourselves with the concept of gender roles and what we should or shouldn't do. I know that this doesn't just come from language, but because as a linguist, for me, it's a good place to start.
Because it's everywhere all the time.
Absolutely, yeah.
So yes, it's very nice to hear you talking about it because it's a subject that concerns me, obviously, and I've especially this month that it's June is important for the LGBT. I won't say the rest of the letters because I don't even know them. I always get to a place and say plus because like it's hard to keep up. We all know that. But yeah, so I've spoken to another couple of people who have also talked about the subject, and so it's something that concerns me in the sense that I think people need to know that it's out there being discussed, and that there are alternatives, options, and all of that. So what can we expect from you in the future? It's like a deep question. Where will you be in
Yes.
5 years? Like in job interviews? No, just kidding. Now,
Absolutely.
while you do your research and you do your
Yes.
work, so what's going to be going on the next couple of years?
Yes, so I will be continuing my research, of course. Still very passionate about my interpreting career, so I will be continuing with that too. I would also be fascinated in looking at different languages. I speak Czech too, and I feel like focusing on the idea of inclusive language in Czech could be extremely interesting because the gender is omnipresent in Czech and other Slavic languages. Not only do they have three genders, but also, like for example, the past participle is always dictated by the gender of the person who's speaking, conditional forms, etc., adjectives. It's omnipresent. So I think it would be extremely interesting to look at Slavic languages too, because most of my focus has been in Romance languages. And yes, that's basically my life for the next
What's
couple
the
of
story
years.
with Czech? Now I'm curious. You have to tell me a little bit about it. Why that? Why Czech?
Why Czech?
I have friends
partner...
who speak Romanian, like British people who speak Romanian and all that. I'm like my friend Kirsty Wolf, she speaks Romanian, and I've heard that she's really, really good at it. And I'm like, why? So I have to have these conversations with people because it's just fascinating to me that you decide as an adult to learn something. Maybe there is an emotional reason why, or sometimes it's just for professional reasons, or because you enjoy learning languages like Christy, which is like amazing to me.
maybe a combination of all three, but
Okay.
but mostly for love because my partner is from the Czech Republic. So
I thought we had a French person here, but I guess not.
no, she's just very passionate about French inclusive language. Because we studied French together at university.
So the French was the language of love for you, right?
I guess you could say that. Yeah, I guess you could say that.
For me, French just exists because of terminology and technical things, not for my passions, I have to say. It's like I like it from a technical point of view. I love the grammar. I love how they deal with things. I love all of that. I love their dictionaries, just the best. And because I love lexicography, so of course I have to have the French reference, and I absolutely adore it from that point of view. But I would say it's my quiet language, as I call it.
Quiet language.
I love speaking everything else, but French is a whole other story because I've studied more than any other language, believe it or not. But then just circumstances always led me towards the English-speaking world. My brother is exactly the opposite. So both of us always very focused on English. But then when he was, I don't know, 12 or 15 or something, he just totally fell in love with French. And ever since, he's been living in French-speaking countries and only working always for French companies. Always. So that's funny. So that's what he does. So he absolutely, like, he's almost a native speaker. So I understand that people fall in love with it. Obviously, it's very popular for its sex appeal, I guess. That's not really. I can listen to music. I love their movies. I love the technical parts of it, grammar, all of that stuff. Love using it for terminology. I mean, it gives you a lot of clues. And also the materials in linguistics, like early linguistics. It's also very, very good. And especially me focusing on lexicology and lexicography and terminology, like my three loves. And so for me, French is very relevant from that point of view. But I have to say that I don't know what I call the real life or the commercial life and in the social life of French. That's something that is a bit unknown to me. So it's always interesting for people to talk a little bit about it, because it's my quiet language. It's the only thing, the only moment when I'm quiet. If I'm thinking in French, then I'm totally quiet. No one would want to hear it.
I love that idea of a quiet language.
Yeah, that's the one. That's the one. It's here, but it doesn't speak. I don't speak because I've never done it. I never have to do it, and so I don't do it. But sometimes I'm like, maybe I should just make an effort and make it a more present thing in my existence. But so far, it hasn't happened. So I feel very comfortable with my Spanish and my English and all of that, and I speak very fast and blah blah blah. I say whatever I want, which is fantastic. But then for French, it's a whole other story. I would have to probably think deeper, and harder. And so you never know what the future holds, but I don't think so. It's the same with learning German. You never know. Kirsty is always encouraging me. I don't know if you know who she is. I'm talking about her, but
Yes, yeah, I see her content a lot on LinkedIn.
yeah. Now we're doing our networking together and things like that. So any other messages that you would like to talk to us about?
I think my final message, as I touched on before, is basically that language isn't fixed. It's not something that belongs to anybody. It belongs to everybody. What I mean to say is, it's up to us to decide how we use it, and that we shouldn't be told that the way we use it is wrong. I'm not a huge believer in linguistic puritanism by any means. And I would say to people that, especially people like me who are language learners, who might feel like that we're somehow breaking rules by wanting to be more inclusive, for example, for not wanting to be seen as making mistakes, just go for it. Just go for it. And maybe with time, things will change. Let's just give it a go. Don't be scared.
Let's all try a few techniques and see how it goes, and then report your results. Thank you so much for this, Beth. It's been great to talk to you, and of course, a lot of information about this subject. So I guess it's very important and very relevant that people get to know you and your perspective, and how this is now having an impact and the presence in the communities and social media and everything else that we do in shows and events and conferences and everything else. So I guess it was really important that you went a little bit deeper than usual into the subject, and I thank you for that.
Thank you very much for having me, Rita. It was an absolute pleasure.
Thank you.
Hope to speak to you again.
Bye.
Bye.
Yeah, for sure. I'm sure we will. Bye.